Oh, yes, the Mongolian Death Worm. So, the Mongolian Death Worm is one of those legends that have seeped into the current day. So, we have creatures like gnomes and fairies, which, like, I think Iceland still believes in gnomes and stuff like that. But for the most part, people go, oh, gnomes may have been around back in the day. Well, I don't think most people think gnomes are around, but you know what I mean? Like, there are creatures that are considered far, far in the past that we don't have to deal with anymore. Dragons is a good idea of that. And then there's creatures that have old legends about them, and they're still being seen, and that would cover stuff like Bigfoot. And that also would cover the creature, the Mongolian Death Worm. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Mongolian Death Worm is, it's interesting because just like the Jabu Fofi, the giant spider we talked about on Tuesday, I believe, the Mongolian Death Worm, all the sightings are secondhand. There's been no Western explorer to actually be able to say, oh, we saw that. Not like it's important that it has to be Western, but you know what I mean? Like, most of the sightings we have is someone talking to someone else and then being like, oh, yeah, I saw that. And the descriptions are all fairly the same. If I saw a monster and then you saw a monster independently, we may have different versions of what that monster looks like. But if we both saw a tiger, I may see it from behind and I may describe it a little bit differently than you. But you could compare both events and say, well, they're probably talking about a tiger. They're probably both, one person saw it in the shadows, so it just looked like a giant cat with a certain type of ear structure, and the other person saw it in the day and it had stripes, but he couldn't really see his head because he was, I don't know, drinking water or eating an ostrich. And so the Mongolian Death Worm, I won't say all, but most of the descriptions are the same. It's not, you'll watch movies, and Mongolian Death Worm is, I've seen it in a couple movies. I actually saw one really good one that I'm going to put the link to. It's not a movie so much. There was a television show, I don't know if it's still around, I don't think so, called The Lost Tapes, and it was basically a found footage television show. It was really good. It was about, I think it was these three young men on ATVs doing some cross-continent race, and their ATVs break down in the Gobi Desert, and the Mongolian Death Worm stalking them. So it kind of has this Tremors vibe, because as long as they're on the ATV and totally immobile, the Mongolian Death Worm doesn't know that they're there. So it was really good. I'll put that link in there. I recommend you watching it. But generally in movies, they portray this Mongolian Death Worm as this giant creature the size of a graboid from Tremors. And the local descriptions of it are, it's about 3 meters long. I don't know what that is in English, because, the only real measurement system is feet and inches. But I think 3 meters long, is something like 4 feet or something like that. I don't know. But anyways, so it's relative. That's the size. That's a size of a medium-sized snake. That's fairly believable. What makes people doubt that it exists is that it has two other attributes that people are like, maybe that's just made up. One is it spits out some sort of toxin. So you have this 3-foot-long worm that it burrows underground, and when somebody's walking over it, it jumps out at you and bites you. It can also jump out at you and spit a toxin at you. And you're like, well, there's animals that do that. There's animals that shoot out toxin. They're definitely toxic animals. The Mongolian Death Worm has another attribute, is that it can release electricity. It can shock people near it. So if you're walking on the ground, the first thing you may feel, as opposed to walking in the sky, I guess, but as you're walking, the first thing you'll feel is a sharp electric shock. It kind of stuns you and you'll fall down, and then it can kind of take its time with you, spray the poison in your face, eat what's left. Now, this creature has had sightings going back as long as there are people in the area. It came to the West's attention, I believe, like back in 1920, and at that time, so the Mongolian Prime Minister at that time was like, I've seen a death worm. He could describe it. And what's funny is that for a long time, there was actually a ban in the country for hunting the death worm. They just didn't want to deal with people going out there. Now, it's not the most... I'm sure they're having a bunch of crackpots going out there and dying of dehydration because it is a desert after all. But I always think it's interesting when governments enact rules. I think it's in Nepal or somewhere out there, out east, where it's against the law to harass a Yeti. You can't go Yeti hunting. They're like a protected species. So sometimes it's a publicity stunt. I actually think it's illegal to hunt Bigfoots in Washington as well. It might be a publicity stunt. It might just be, it might be a publicity stunt. It may be real. They're like, man, we don't want people going out there and getting killed by these Mongolian death worms. It's most likely a publicity stunt. But so you have this creature. It's blood red because what happens is it lays its eggs inside a camel's intestines, and they eat up I'm assuming, dead camel. They eat it up, and it just gives them this red coloring. And they say that it's just a silent predator. It just lives in the desert. It'll kill anything. It'll eat anything. It just like most and this is an interesting fact of it too. When you're making stuff up, if it's made up, you can make up whatever it does. You can be like, yes, it's the size of a house, and it will swallow your firstborn child, then it'll come over to where you work, and it'll start knocking pins off your desk. You just make it up. If you're making it up, that's actually a fairly relative size for something that's, you're like, well, how big was it? And you're like, I don't know, 3 meters? I mean, that sounds more realistic. Also, they generally don't hunt humans. They prefer to hunt animals, but will kill a human if need be. So again, when we look at stuff like the Groot sling, and they're like, it was created by the gods, and it's one of the most intelligent creatures on the planet, and it steals people's gold, that sounds far more made up than, there's a really big worm in the desert that shoots acid and can shock you, and it will usually eat an animal, but it might eat you too. So, the Mongolian, the stuff like the Groot sling, I like the idea of it. I don't think it exists. The giant spider from Tuesday's episode and the Mongolian Death Worm, I think, are very likely to exist. If not existing today, existed at some point in human history. And that's why those legends have been passed down. I'm not saying you can, book a flight to the Gobi Desert right now, parachute in, and find one, because no Westerner has ever seen one. Well, at least ever seen one and survived to talk about it. But again, if this creature isn't necessarily hunting humans and it is under the ground, what are the chances of you trying to find it in a desert? It's a massive desert. They don't know how many of these things are. But this is one of those cryptids that if we found evidence of it, I wouldn't be surprised at all. If we found giant spiders, and giant spiders have exoskeletons, but when they die, I wonder how they fossilize. I'm sure we found fossilized spiders from in the past, but I wonder how they... Oh, and that's dope about this thing too. Mongolian Death Worm actually has an exoskeleton as well. And when it's damaged, when it's attacked, it can actually molt off its armor and grow new armor. So they're fairly difficult to kill. They're not impossible. I mean, obviously, if you shot one, it's dead. But it's mostly built for protecting against animal attacks, where if, I don't know what else lives out in the Gobi Desert, if a paku attacks it, it can be like, ha ha ha, and then just take off that piece of broken armor, have some new one, and then he shocks him and eats him. So I don't know. The Mongolian Death Worm, I'm going to put in the possible category of my cryptid category I just made up for this episode. I'm going to count it as possible. It may not have I think the least likely thing out of everything it's described is the electrical ability. I don't think the size is ridiculous. I don't think the venom's ridiculous. I don't think the environment or what it hunts and all this stuff. The electrical shock thing is probably the most fantastical thing. But the only thing that really makes people doubt this is they've never seen one. Everything else fits into how big these type of creatures can be, what it would eat, how it would live, and things like that. And again, with the giant spider, the only it acts like a spider, it hunts like a spider, does everything like a spider. The only thing people debate is, it can't get that big. As opposed to the Groot sling, which is completely mythological, or the Atawa, the tiny, tiny ant-sized humans. I mean, those aren't just on its face completely untrue. So... I do recommend, I haven't watched, I said I've seen those other Death Worm movies, as in I've seen they exist. I haven't watched any of the other Death Worm movies, but actually I probably am going to. But I recommend you guys watch the Lost Tapes, and again, I'll put that link in below. That was a clip from our daily podcast, Dead Rabbit Radio. Dead Rabbit Radio is available anywhere that you listen to podcasts. It's daily paranormal, conspiracy, and true crime news. If you want to hear the full episode that this clip came from, check the link below. Please like and subscribe. And hit that little bell, too. That does some magical stuff. Thanks, guys.